Hello and welcome to this episode in the De Morgan's online lecture series. Today it's my pleasure to welcome Alexandra Earl to talk about her technical examination of Evelyn De Morgan's paintings. Alexandra is in her final year of studying conservation and easel paintings at the Courtauld Institute of Art and has been studying very intently some of De Morgan's paintings. As well as this, she has been looking at artworks across Pre-Raphaelite collections, including a recent study at Tate Britain before coming back to her study at the Courtauld. So any questions about anything technical with Evelyn De Morgan's paintings, and Alexandra really is the person to ask, so I very much hope you will. And without further ado, I'll hand over to you, Alexandra. Very, very warm welcome, and thank you very much for speaking today.
Thank you very much. I will just share my screen so you can all see my PowerPoint. Let's see. Okay, hopefully you can all see that. So thank you, Sarah, for the introduction. As Sarah mentioned, I will be discussing the materials and techniques employed by Evelyn De Morgan during her career between 1890 and 1919. So as part of my studies at the Courtauld Institute of Art, in collaboration with the De Morgan Foundation, I have spent the last few months undertaking an art historical and scientific research of De Morgan's paintings. This has resulted in a thesis which aims to recenter De Morgan into the body of practicing Victorian artists by means of technical study. So by finding new primary material coupled with the first in-depth technical analysis of her paintings and her palette, De Morgan's oeuvre can therefore be better understood, thus contributing to the expanding recognition of De Morgan as an artist in her own right. So in terms of the structure of this talk, I will briefly describe the artistic context for De Morgan's practice. So this includes her training at the Slade School of Art, her travels to Italy, and her relationship with the Pre-Raphaelites. I'll then go into more detail about De Morgan's materials in relation to Pre-Raphaelite techniques. This involves her choice of canvas supports and how they were prepared, her underdrawing and preliminary sketches, her choice of pigments and painting medium, as well as her painting technique and choice of varnish. The focus of my studies was really the close analysis of two paintings. The one on the left is Queen Eleanor and the Fair Rosamund, painted between 1901 and 1902. And then we have In Memoriam on the right, which was painted between 1890 and 1919. Whilst both paintings stylistically reflect Pre-Raphaelitism, technical analysis has helped to prompt a reappraisal of the view that De Morgan was merely a late Pre-Raphaelite. But before discussing the results of my technical analysis, I will first provide some artistic context for De Morgan's practice during the 19th century. So as a female artist in 19th century Britain, De Morgan was undoubtedly overshadowed by her male counterparts. As a consequence, the artist remained absent from studies of Victorian art and scholarly literature until the late 1980s and 1990s. Despite this marginalisation, De Morgan was determined in becoming an artist and was evidently not deterred by the obstacles or critical indifference that faced her. And I think that her passion is really demonstrated in a note that she made in her diary at age 17, where she states, "Art is eternal, but life is short. I will make up for it now. I have not a moment to lose." Now, during her youth, De Morgan was educated at home by tutors, which gave her access to classical subjects that girls her age were typically restricted from. And in support of her ambition, Evelyn's father hired a tutor in the 1870s to teach her how to draw from old master paintings, such as those by Michelangelo or Leonardo da Vinci. De Morgan's studies continued at the South Kensington National Art Training School in 1872, followed by enrolment the following year at the Slade School of Art, in which she was actually one of the first women to attend. De Morgan took life drawing classes each day, in which she would draw from the draped nude for 5 hours, and then from the antique model for a further 3. Although the permitting of female students to study from life was revolutionary at the time, women were still banned from drawing nude models. Nevertheless, De Morgan's several slave studies are an exemplar of her draftsmanship and meticulous observation of the human form. Now, the analysis of one of De Morgan's painted slave studies, which we have on the slide here on the right, is actually being conserved at the Courtauld Institute of Art, and the technical analysis has revealed the method in which students were instructed to paint from the live model. So this involved preparing the canvas with a tone that was similar to the wall of the room, so that no background needed to be painted and all the focus was placed on the nude model. Then the nude model itself was painted by first applying the lead contours of the figure, and then this was followed by the flesh tones, and any highlights were reserved for the final touches. De Morgan's Slade sketchbook also contains numerous illustrations of bones and muscles, which shows an astute understanding of the human form. And this also reflects how De Morgan attended anatomy lectures, which were aimed at fine art students at the Slade. And these lessons would have taught her how to accurately and convincingly portray the movement of the human body under the flow of draperies. Throughout her career, De Morgan continued to draw from nude models using chalk, charcoal, and pastel. And in particular, De Morgan's unique and consistent practice of drawing the double study of a nude figure followed by the draped figure is a testament to how her education significantly impacted the construction of her compositions. So for example, here on the slide, we have the nude and the draped study for Earthbound, which interestingly is of a female. So perhaps De Morgan later reused this preparatory sketch for the male figure in Earthbound, which was painted later. In regards to painting materials, in 1885, De Morgan established an account with Charles Robeson and Co., which was a prominent colourman based in London during the 19th century. William De Morgan, Evelyn's husband, also held an account with Robeson from October 1861 to April 1919. However, it does appear that most of the orders were intended for Evelyn after their marriage in 1887. Robeson provided the artist with large quantities of extra fine hoghair brushes, powdered pigments, tubed oil paints, varnishes, and canvases. So in fact, from reading the Robeson accounts, we can see that De Morgan purchased 2 oval palettes on the 5th of August 1885, which remain in the De Morgan collection. And the analysis of one palette in particular indicated the remnants of cobalt violet paint, as well as viridian and iron-containing pigments. The accounts of both William and Evelyn also include additional pigments. So, for example, we can see that they used genuine ultramarine, zinc white, madder red, vermilion, yellow ochre, and cake of gold. Now, there is isolated evidence for Evelyn's choice of suppliers and materials prior to her Robeson account, suggesting that she perhaps bought from several suppliers before committing to a specific colourman. So, for example, De Morgan likely used local suppliers during her trips to Italy when she would visit her uncle, John Rodham Spencer Stanhope. And I should note that during these trips, she was completely exposed to the art of the old masters, and her engagement with Quattrocento art is especially apparent in her watercolour sketches of prominent artworks by Sandro Botticelli. Now, moving on to the technical examination, which I've been undertaking, both of Queen Eleanor and the Fair Rosamund and In Memoriam, it was conducted over a 9-week period at the Courtauld Institute of Art using the array of imaging and analytical methods that we have here on site. And I'll briefly just describe the content of both paintings. So first of all, we have Queen Eleanor and the Fair Rosamund, which was taken from the legend of Rosamund, who was the mistress of Henry II. And she was locked away in a bower surrounded by a complex maze to keep her hidden from the Queen. So we have here, Queen Eleanor is depicted in her pearl-studded drapery with shimmering green and purple highlights, holding a string which cuts across the composition, and she's being surrounded by some evil creatures in the form of dragons and apes, and there's a bat that's just been painted above her head. According to the legend, the king unknowingly left a thin skein of silk from Rosamund's dress, which exposed his path through the maze. And then upon finding Rosamund, Queen Eleanor forced her to decide between death by dagger or poison, and she chose the latter. De Morgan's composition was undoubtedly inspired by Swinburne's play entitled Rosamund, which was written in 1860. And De Morgan would have been influenced by contemporary depictions of the legend, such as those by Edward Burne-Jones, whom she knew. And here on screen, this comparison kind of emphasizes how De Morgan's work is often associated with Pre-Raphaelitism due to the draw-like colors, the microscopic detail, and obviously the literary influence. Now, on the other hand, In Memoriam illustrates how the outbreak and the horrors of World War I immensely impacted De Morgan, as she turned to a symbolic practice to express her sentiments, and this led to a pacifist theme in her paintings. De Morgan's social consciousness is most notable in other paintings, such as SOS and the Red Cross, which were exhibited in her Fulham studio in 1916, along with In Memoriam, which in itself represents inconsolable loss and remembrance, rather than sort of the pride in the deeds of a heroic warrior. So for example, in the center, we have this solitary female figure clothed in sumptuous purple drapery, seated on a stone bench reminiscent of a funerary monument. Here she is grabbing a wreath of yellow flowers, and she's hanging her head sort of to mourn the deceased. Now, Wilhelmina Sterling, who was De Morgan's younger sister, notes that In Memoriam was painted in Florence, which may explain the large date range which is attributed to the painting. So it's 1890 to 1919. This also suggests that perhaps the artist started painting this composition in her studio. She may have traveled to Italy back and forth during some years and then returned to the artwork after some time. Also, in creating this work, De Morgan may have been inspired by other paintings or artworks. So for example, for me, In Memoriam bears similarities to Nike unbinding her sandal from the balustrade of the Ionic temple of Athena Nike. And I can also see some similarities with Leighton's Flaming June, especially in sort of the drapery, the profile of the female's head, and also this sunrise behind the figure, which seems to bear some sunlight on her flesh tones. So this is just an interesting comparison to think about, but it's also likely that De Morgan was, again, influenced by literary writings. So for example, Alfred Tennyson's poem In Memoriam, which was written in 1850 and emphasizes that there is no fear associated with death, only of separation. Now, considering De Morgan's position in Victorian society and the establishment of various artistic movements during the 19th century, the artist would have been critically engaged with discussions on painting materials and techniques. De Morgan was introduced to the Pre-Raphaelite circle through her family and her close friends, most notably Stanhope and George Frederick Watts. In 1884, De Morgan's lease of Trafalgar Studios in Chelsea brought her closer to William's studio, where she was surrounded by a strong artistic community. So for example, William's friendship with his colleague William Morris was particularly significant for De Morgan, as she remained lifelong friends with May Morris, and Jane Morris actually sat for De Morgan's The Hourglass as one of her final appearances as a Pre-Raphaelite model. De Morgan's distinct social circle can also be ascertained through artist correspondence and diary entries. So arguably, this letter found from William Holman Hunt to De Morgan in 1895 best exemplifies the respect that she gained from her contemporaries. Although I have yet to fully sort of dissect the contents of this letter, I think that the fact that a prominent Pre-Raphaelite painter is seen asking for De Morgan's advice in tempera painting emphasises that she clearly had a sophisticated knowledge and she was respected by her contemporaries. And I think that this letter in particular makes a good case for why looking at her technique is important to understand her more as an artist. So moving on to materials, 19th century artists in De Morgan's circle primarily bought their materials from Charles Robeson and Co., Brown of High Holborn, and Winsor and Newton. Artists' preferred canvas support appears to have been a pre-stretched, primed, plain weave canvas, which was popular due to its smooth surface, which was ideal for thin glazes. For the very best canvases, such as that for artworks like Millet's Ophelia, 2 identical pre-primed canvases were placed on the same stretcher, back to back, to provide extra support and protection. And similarly, I found that Queen Eleanor has been painted on a fine plain weave canvas with this same reversed primed loose lining. So in this case, we have both canvases stretched with the priming visible on the back, which we can see in the image on the right here. De Morgan's Robeson account also indicates that the artist often chose this double canvas system, highlighting that she was clearly concerned about the stability and the longevity of her paintings. Now, De Morgan appears to have used a wide variety of canvas sizes throughout her career. The artist Robeson account reveals that she bought rolls of unstretched pre-primed canvases for her larger compositions, but typically favoured pre-stretched primed Roman canvases. And now the identification of colourman stamps has helped to find the supplier of De Morgan's canvases. So for example, I have found a Winsor & Newton stamp and a W.H. Monk colourman stamp found on the reverse of De Morgan's The Barred Gate, which was painted in 1919, and I have behind me here today. The Winton canvas was firm in substance, it was produced with an even texture, and it has a grain about midway between the single primed and the Roman varieties, making it quite popular. William Henry Monk, who had the colourman stamp just below the Winsor & Newton, which you can see on the slide, he was a colourman who traded at 201 King's Road in Chelsea from 1889. And this stamp serves as proof that De Morgan bought from this colourman during her residence in London. And it also helps with sort of the dating of her paintings. Now, during the mid-19th century, a typical commercially prepared canvas involved applying a ground consisting of linseed oil with lead white and an extender such as inexpensive chalk or barium sulfate. There would have been several applications of the chalk-rich mixture, followed by at least one layer of lead white for good hiding power and opacity. Now, for the cross-sections that you can see on the screen show that the priming in Queen Eleanor has this typical commercial priming. So the first ground being a low opacity layer of chalk with some lead white, followed by a second denser layer of lead white with little chalk. In particular, the lead white would have served as a strong reflective surface beneath De Morgan's thin transparent paint applications. And contrastingly, we can see below that the canvas for In Memoriam was primed using a single layer of chalk, lead white and barium sulfate over an animal glue size layer. Now this size layer acts to saturate and protect the canvas from embrittlement by the oil paint. Now, although working directly from life was crucial to the Ruskinian truth to nature tenet of the Pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, the Pre-Raphaelites made very few sketches for their paintings. Instead, they used graphite to work directly on the canvas from the motif. Certainly, by developing the composition on the canvas, it avoided the need to transfer designs by squaring up or tracing from a cartoon. So, for example, here we have some infrared images which show that the Pre-Raphaelites defined the exact composition of their figures and that the painted image rarely deviates from the initial underdrawing. There is no evidence of hatching to indicate shadows, since this would have destroyed the purity of the white ground underneath. The Pre-Raphaelites, most notably Hunt and Millet, would then typically paint the background in situ first, leaving a reserve for the figure to then be painted in their studio. The Pre-Raphaelites generally modelled their figures from friends or lay figures. So, for example, we have here Millet's preparatory sketches for Christ in the house of his parents. As a result, we can see that Millet typically only draws limbs that were not covered by clothing, so we can't see the limbs continue underneath the draperies. And I think as a result, there is a sense of sort of stiffness to his figures, and this perhaps contributed to the controversy surrounding this work, in which critics, including Charles Dickens, were perturbed by the willful distortions of human form. Now, moving on to De Morgan, infrared reflectography revealed carefully executed underdrawing for the figure's features, drapery, and the interior in both paintings. De Morgan carefully positions the flowers on Rosamund's pink garments, whereas the shimmering scales on Eleanor's dress were painted without an initial underdrawing. Again, there is no suggestion of hatching, and the hands and the faces seem to have a very, very clear outline. Exposed area of underdrawing in the background, as well as in Rosamund's eyes, revealed that De Morgan used a fluid blue drawing implement. And analysis on a cross-section indicated that this drawing media was perhaps carbon-based. I could not see any evidence of phosphorus or any splintered particles which are characteristic of charcoal. And therefore, I think that the medium was possibly graphite or lamp black, which typically has this bluish black colour when viewed under a microscope. Although the underdrawing in both compositions is detailed, there are some changes that can be seen using technical analysis. So, for example, in an X-radiograph of Queen Eleanor, we see that there is this dark shape showing that Eleanor's sleeve was adjusted by removing paint. As observed in other Pre-Raphaelite works, unforeseen mistakes were corrected by scraping away the paint to avoid muddying the depiction of colour and light. So in the centre here, we see a raking light image of the sleeve, showing how De Morgan used a palette knife to scrape down to the canvas, remove the paint that she no longer wanted, and then she would apply paint directly on top without applying a ground in that specific area. As a result of not applying a ground, we see that the texture of the canvas weave is very prominent in this area. And again, that is emphasised when looking under the microscope. Now, interestingly, the same technique of removing paint was identified in The Love Potion, which was painted by De Morgan in 1903. De Morgan interestingly scraped down the window, which was initially painted half closed, and that is emphasised in the infrared reflectogram we have here. So you can see that this bottle glass window was originally drawn and painted half closed, but for the final composition, it was completely eliminated, and instead this bottle glass window is open. Also in the infrared reflectogram, we see there is a bridge in the background, which again, De Morgan decided not to include in the painted composition for the final work. So just here. Now, I just wanted to include these images because a similar bottle glass window was found in works by De Morgan's friends, including Mary Stillman's Mariana and Ford Madox Brown, Romeo and Juliet. So again, we see this half-open bottle glass window, and it's just interesting to think that perhaps because they were friends, De Morgan painted or took inspiration from Stillman's house, where she would visit and often paint. Now, unlike the Pre-Raphaelites, De Morgan made numerous preparatory sketches for her compositions, the majority of which follow the sequence of drawing a nude figure over which clothes are draped. We have two nude studies for Queen Eleanor and the Fair Rosamund, which reflect De Morgan's slave teachings in first drawing from the nude model in order to accurately depict clothed figures. As a result, in many of her compositions, we see that the drapery falls in a realistic manner and the silhouette of the figures can be distinguished underneath. We also have a detailed oil study for the composition, which demonstrates De Morgan's method of draping figures, planning colour schemes, and situating figures within an interior prior to painting. The oil sketch shows that the painting, the initial background was conceived a lot differently to the final composition. So, for example, the stained glass window was large, it was square-shaped. The blue wallpaper featured white doves, and there was a hinged door in the background. These features were better described in the final painting, with the arched window and the wallpaper no longer running as a continuous flat space, thus creating an angled back surface and a greater sense of depth. The wooden panelling, as well as the figure's drapery and jewellery, became far more elaborate in the painting stage. And considering that the oil study does not include any of the creatures surrounding Queen Eleanor, and no reserve was made for them in the underdrawing stage, these creatures arguably stemmed from De Morgan's imagination rather than a premeditated idea. Concurrently, De Morgan's unique inclusion of shadowy, evil emanations was likely inspired by Swinburne's description of this very dark and confrontational scene. Likewise, Swinburne's reference to Rosamund as a vessel of purity and sensuality is symbolised through De Morgan's later edition of doves and winged cherubs amongst these pink roses that have been scattered on the floor. Although De Morgan was known to use various models for her paintings, the identity of the figures in both works is uncertain. However, we do have two head studies which relate to the figure of the love potion, and they do bear resemblance to the face of Queen Eleanor. However, you'll note that De Morgan has exaggerated the figure's sharp, angular nose, her chin, and her brow to enhance the evil demeanour of Eleanor, which again will offset Rosamund's delicate features. Comparatively, infrared reflectography indicated that De Morgan executed precise underdrawing for the figure's facial features and the drapery in Memoriam. And technical analysis has ultimately helped to understand why In Memoriam was perhaps painted over such a long period, as we found that the artist made significant and symbolic changes during the painting process. For example, close examination indicated that the cliffs in the background and the wreath of flowers were not included in the underdrawing stage, but rather painted over the background, perhaps as an afterthought. I also have these two details here. The top is an infrared reflectogram and then the X-radiograph underneath. And in the infrared reflectogram, we can see the outline of a sunrise directly behind the figure's head. This was initially underdrawn, but again, not painted as part of the final composition. And in the X-radiograph, we see that De Morgan painted a second sun in the left corner of the background, but this was eventually painted over and again, not included in the final image. But making these changes, I think that the appearance of a sunrise in the background, which we see in today's image, is perhaps an expression of hope and possibly reflects De Morgan's belief in the afterlife. I'll also note that I found two sort of candle-shaped objects either side of the figure just sitting on the windowsill. And these again were also eliminated during the painting process and are not included in the final image. But after looking at these reworkings, you could argue that De Morgan made these changes perhaps after her war, maybe when her emotions were changing, and she wanted to include some undoubtedly symbolic elements in this work. Through close looking, I also discovered that De Morgan drew perspective lines in her works to achieve certain structures within the interior, whether this be flooring or the windows behind figures. So in these examples here, we see that in rendering the floor in both Queen Eleanor, In Memoriam, and the Love Potion, De Morgan uses like a grid-like pattern to plan the placement of the square tiles. And you can see these indentations where the paint was still drying and she's gone over to score these lines into the wet paint. It is likely that De Morgan's method of planning this sort of composition not only derived from her study of Renaissance paintings, but also from her attendance to lectures on perspective at the Slade. So again, this perhaps derived from her education at the Slade, and she continued this technique of perspective lines throughout her oeuvre. For In Memoriam, we have 3 preparatory studies which show what considerable effort was made into developing the sorrowful pose for In Memoriam. The pose, you'll see, does differ slightly, but they all do relate to that in the final work. We have the sketch at Marchmont House, which you see in the centre. It really emphasises how De Morgan perfected the rendering of drapery so that it clings to the human form, but simultaneously cascades down the figure in this sort of spiraling motion. And I think that this accuracy would not have been possible without having first depicted the nude study, which we have on the left here. This practice is in marked contrast to the Pre-Raphaelites, who were committed to drawing the full draped figure without first considering its nude form. And then I've just included a third study on the right here, which shows the sun in the left corner, which was initially planned in the preparatory study and was seen in the X-ray, but not considered for the final composition. So again, it's interesting to just see how De Morgan's thinking changed through each step, from her preparatory studies to underdrawing and then to painting. She did not stick to a complete plan, but was perhaps more experimental and changed symbolic elements in the painting depending on the way that she was feeling at the time. Now, for both artworks, the painted figures follow De Morgan's preparatory sketches quite closely, with almost no deviation from the original intent, especially with the figures. So the outline of the figures and the drapery seems to match the preparatory studies almost identically, whereas the symbolic elements in the interior does differ depending on the painting and the preparatory sketch. I haven't found any evidence of pouncing or pinholes or squaring up using a grid, but this digital overlay does suggest that some kind of transfer technique was used for the figures in particular, because they do match up almost perfectly. De Morgan's use of a transfer technique could be further evidenced by her Robeson account, where we can see that she purchased mounted cartoon paper in 1886. So perhaps she was using this in her painting method, but it's unclear. It could have also been used by William De Morgan as well. So we can't reach to conclusions just yet. Although De Morgan's potential transfer technique is inconclusive, the selection of nude and drape studies for Queen Eleanor and In Memoriam represent how successful the Slade was in inculcating her to this lifelong practice of drawing from life. And technical analysis has ultimately uncovered De Morgan's intellectual and practical process involving in the production of her paintings. And this was an aspect that was only previously speculated among her contemporaries, who stated that there must have been great sketches of labour between her dreams and their realisation. But here with technical analysis, we can really see these steps separated out and understand her thinking process behind working on these paintings. As a result of developments in inorganic chemistry and technological advances in the dye industry, new colours flooded the Victorian market, and artists became increasingly aware of the composition of their paints. As a student from the Slade, it is likely that De Morgan would have been familiar with oil paint and medium preparations, having worked with both ready-prepared paints and those that she would grind and make herself. Examples of pigments commonly chosen by the Pre-Raphaelites include cobalt blue, natural ultramarine, emerald green, and chrome yellow. And now these preference for very transparent pigments meant that there was a greater transmission of light and a more saturated colour was achieved in their paintings. And then again, we have this brilliant white ground, which reflected light back through the paint layer, which further exploited the optical properties of their choice of pigments. I should note that the principal white pigment used at the time was lead white, despite its tendency to yellow as it dried and its toxicity. So during the 19th century, there was a search for a more stable and less toxic alternative to lead white. And in doing so, zinc white was recognized as a more permanent pigment, since it did not change color. Additionally, there were other highly toxic pigments, such as emerald green, which was very popular among the Pre-Raphaelites due to its great beauty and permanency. This was in fact actually the only green pigment that Hunt bought from Robeson, and it's found in many of Rossetti's paintings analysed at Tate. But I will note further that Evelyn was sort of more experimental with her choice of pigments. She didn't stick to one particular type of green and blue. She tended to mix colour combinations to create the tone that she desired. But I will discuss that a bit later on. In terms of lake pigments, George Field's madder lakes were manufactured by him, and then he sold them through Robeson. And these were particularly prominent, popular among the Pre-Raphaelites for their stability and their brilliance. Madder lake is a pigment that is made from boiling the root of the madder plant, and it was initially used as a textile dye in ancient Egypt. So here on the slide, I have an example of red madder being identified in a cross-section taken from the red dress in Rossetti's Sibylla Palmifera. And you're able to identify a lake pigment because it fluoresces this bright pink colour when it's viewed under ultraviolet light. Now, another type of lake pigment is rose madder, which again fluoresces under ultraviolet light, but it has this more characteristic salmony pink colour, and it's readily apparent in Stanhope's Love and the Maidens and Holman Hunt's Valentine rescuing Sylvia from Proteus. So here are just some examples which I was able to compare these examples to my analysis of De Morgan's works. So here, for example, we see again this very salmony pink fluorescence, which is characteristic of rose madder, and this is Queen Eleanor being viewed under ultraviolet light. So we can see for the Cupid's wings, we have this very pink fluorescence, and then some elements of Queen Eleanor's drapery and her lips are very, very bright, brightly pink. According to De Morgan's Robeson account, she did use madder lakes in her practice. However, I'll have to use more analysis using liquid chromatography to be certain that a madder lake was used. Lake pigments are very hard to distinguish, and unfortunately we don't have the equipment here at the Courtauld, so I'd have to go externally to do some more analysis on this pigment in particular. However, I should note that when I was searching for information on De Morgan's pigments, an initial indication of the artist's choice of pigments was obtained from handwritten notes found in a sketchbook owned by De Morgan's mother, Anna Maria Spencer Stanhope. These notes contain pigment combinations for certain colours, such as she writes indigo with vermilion makes opaque purple grey, and Indian yellow or gamboge with lake makes red orange transparent. So although the handwriting does not match De Morgan's, I think that these notes provide an insight into perhaps the artist's potential awareness of the optical effects of her pigments. And this was helpful because I could compare these colour combinations to what I was finding in my technical examination results. But it's been helpful in understanding her choice of colour combinations in order to create this very unique, vivid colour, which is certainly idiosyncratic to De Morgan. So here we have an example of how it is only through technical analysis that we are able to really determine the pigments employed in De Morgan's compositions. Here I have an example of elemental mapping, which is a non-invasive technique used to detect the elements in the pigments used in her compositions. So here we have a strong detection for iron in the hair for In Memoriam, and you can see that by the very strong green fluorescent image on the right. And this was able to tell me that De Morgan used iron-containing pigments to paint the hair of In Memoriam, so this would include umber colours or yellow ochre, perhaps. And here we have an example of further analysis, which involved taking paint cross-sections from edges of the painting or areas of damage. So here we have a cross-section of the window frame in Memoriam, which shows that it was first painted using this dark orange-red paint for the same orange paint that was painted for the inner window frame. And then in order to create this very metallic-y stone appearance, De Morgan used cobalt blue directly on top of this orange paint. So again, layering up pigments in order to create the tone that she required. But these results have been highly significant and very valuable to my understanding of her layering techniques and her thought process during the painting, her painting method. Here we have another example of elemental mapping, which showed that the wooden panelling in Queen Eleanor was carefully painted using iron-containing pigments, but she also added zinc white, and this was confirmed by taking a paint cross-section. So again, I like this comparison in particular because it just shows how specific and valuable technical imaging is in our understanding of artist technique. And then in terms of green pigments, I took a cross-section from the maze in Queen Eleanor, which revealed that it was painted using 2 layers of chrome yellow mixed with cobalt blue and very little viridian. And I could detect viridium because of the particle's translucent bluish-green appearance and the presence of chromium in elemental analysis. It's interesting to note that De Morgan uses a combination of pigments for green elements, rather than, as I mentioned before, just using emerald green, for example, which was highly popular, but I have not detected emerald green in any of the paintings that I analysed. So it's just interesting to see this comparison of De Morgan's layering technique compared to a single transparent paint layer directly on top of a lead white ground. And then again, here we have an example of finding vermilion, which is a red pigment containing mercury and sulfur. And vermilion was used copiously by De Morgan, and it was detected in particular in these 2 paintings, in the Cupid's wings, in Eleanor's red cape, the poison which she was holding, as well as the pink sky in Memoriam. Now moving on to these lovely photos of the drapery. For In Memoriam, De Morgan used zinc white, iron-containing pigments, ultramarine, and cerulean blue. And I was able to detect cerulean blue due to the strong detection of cobalt and tin in these elemental maps, which you can see on the left. Cerulean blue was a stable pigment that was first listed in Culliman's catalogues from 1860. So again, this is an example of how the detection of pigments can help with dating of paintings. But in this case, it is likely that De Morgan used cerulean blue in combination with ultramarine due to the lack of intensity achieved in using ultramarine alone. And this is actually noted in other Pre-Raphaelite works that because ultramarine was so transparent, artists often found that they had to incorporate other more opaque pigments in order to create this vivid blue that they so required. And in contrast, Queen Eleanor's drapery was rendered using multiple glazes of cobalt violet and cobalt blue. And again, this is demonstrated by the map for cobalt, which you see on the right. Cobalt violet was discovered in 1859. It was detected due to the corresponding results for cobalt and phosphorus in all of the forms of analysis that I was able to undertake on this painting. And I can show you a cross-section, again, taken from the purple drapery, which shows you not only the amount of layers, the paint layers, but the combination of pigments that De Morgan chose to use. by taking a paint cross-section, I could not only see the cobalt blue and the cobalt violet particles, but I could also note that there was cadmium yellow and also vermilion included in painting the drapery. I also detected a very thin pink fluorescent layer, which was characteristic of the lake pigment. And by undertaking further elemental analysis, I was able to defer that this was geranium lake, which is an Eocene-derived organic pigment first synthesized in the 1870s. So again, De Morgan is making very particular choices in terms of layering certain pigments. And you can see that she's building up these glazes in order to create the tone that she desired. And again, it can help with the dating of paintings, because you're able to look back at Cullinan catalogues and when pigments were first synthesized, and able to defer sort of when De Morgan was picking up new pigments or taking from her contemporaries as influences. So it shows how useful technical analysis can be. And again, I just wanted to show you a cross-section from the barred gate, which I took during my conservation of this painting, which is behind me. Again, I detected a very thin pink fluorescent layer. However, this was more of a salmony pink fluorescence, which could suggest the use of a rose madder. However, I would like to do further analysis on this cross-section using liquid chromatography and really sort of understand why this lake pigment was placed sort of sandwiched in between these very thick, particle-heavy paint layers. And it will help me understand the artist's intentions more. But I think this cross-section kind of highlights the different layers very clearly, in that we have the ground layer, we have an underdrawing which is very black, you can see that in UV, and then we have numerous paint layers followed by this resinous varnishy coating on top. So incredibly complex painting, and it just shows how experimental De Morgan was in her painting process. Now, in terms of medium, once the artist had prepared their pigments in oil, the Pre-Raphaelites typically altered the handling characteristics of their paint, as well as the translucency of their paint, by using various mediums. So, for example, artists consistently bought copal-based mediums, which were available from Robeson in the form of copal or Robeson's medium. And due to its glossy appearance, this copal medium allowed the building up of transparent glazes to achieve a solid paint film. I found that De Morgan did use amber colours, which were smooth flowing tube paints containing pigments bound in a drying oil and copal resin. And De Morgan's Robeson account also shows that she frequently purchased pale amber varnish. So again, she was including this varnish, very thick resinous material in with her paints to create this glossy appearance. And here I've just included, again, the same cross-section, which shows this layering of this resinous material in between her paint layers. And this was perhaps to saturate the paint surface as she was painting and create these transparent glazes. I also could see that there were concentrations of medium on the surface of her painting. So, for example, you see this photomicrograph on the bottom. It shows that pools of medium would sit in the interstices of her impasto. So she was obviously using a medium that was very thick, slightly yellow, and mixing this on her palette with her paints to create a certain consistency. And we do know that De Morgan was very experimental with her materials, because there is this letter that exists to May Morris in which she describes the process. I won't read the whole letter out, but basically De Morgan used glycerin and spirit, and she would flood her paintings with oil and varnish and use certain methods to suck out the glycerin from the back of the canvas, which is very complex, and I have yet to try it out myself, but it serves an example of how experimental she was and how unusual her method is. So when examining her works, I didn't come into it with any expectation, but sort of left my mind open to what I might found, because she was so odd in her choice of materials and techniques. Now, in terms of painting technique, both X-radiographs show that the backgrounds in both compositions do not pass behind the figures, which suggested that the figures were painted first, and then the surrounding interiors were applied thereafter. This is very different from the typical sequence adopted by the Pre-Raphaelites, who would typically paint the background first and then paint the figure in the studio. In both paintings, the paint application ranges from transparent medium rich layers to stiff textured highlights. So for example, here we can see the pearls on Eleanor's drapery are particularly apparent in raking light. And you can see that these dappled brush marks for the flesh are very apparent in raking light also. Here we have some details showing the difference between these multiple thin transparent layers used to create the drapery in Queen Eleanor. And this contrasts to certain elements like the jewellery, in which De Morgan would use very opaque paint to create these impastoed elements. And then on the bottom row here, we see a difference in technique in that De Morgan uses sort of she uses a stiff hog's hair brush to create these dappled marks, which creates like a blotched appearance on the drapery of In Memoriam, and you can also see it in the clouds in the sky. So again, it's just showing how she altered her technique depending on the element of the painting. And I think, in particular, what I found was the use of transparent glazes for the drapery in particular allows the white ground to reflect, and it creates this level of luminosity that is completely unachievable by applying these thick opaque applications. So the importance of transparent glazes was something that definitely stood out to me. And then just small elements like the rings and jewellery were opaque and stood out in a very different way, but they were more minute. And then here we have an example of something I discovered which was very unusual, in that De Morgan incorporates gold in two ways for both of her compositions. So for example, on one side we have De Morgan mixing gold into her paint, and this is seen in the hem of Rosamund's drapery and the edges of Queen Eleanor's drapery. And then another technique is that she would apply gold on the canvas prior to painting, and then she would apply paint on top, leaving small gaps so that the gold would shine through. And this was noted on the cherubs and the apes, which you can see in the centre, and for Eleanor's red cloak as well. And here I just wanted to show the significance of taking a paint cross-section, which was able to confirm that there was in fact gold placed on top of the paint layers, which you can see shimmering here in the paint cross-section. Now, for this painting in particular, I should note that although much of the gold is hidden underneath the paint, the optical effect of the gold may have been more illuminating when it was viewed back in the 19th century, when they had warm gas lighting or oil lights or candles. And this does contrast to the cooler lighting systems used in modern day times. So initially, when I looked at these paintings, I could not see the gold at all. However, looking under the microscope or in a raking light or just in different lighting systems, it's certainly striking. So that was just interesting to note, and it was very exciting to find that during my research. And here I can show you how technical analysis confirmed this application of gold for the cupids in Queen Eleanor. So elemental mapping showed that De Morgan blocked in the gold paint to create the shapes of the cupids in the foreground. And this was a very unique technique. I haven't seen it in any other works, because she kind of sets up this reserve with gold, and this echoes what the Pre-Raphaelites would do with zinc white in order to create a more luminous appearance in certain compositional elements. But here De Morgan is doing it with gold instead. So again, creating this luminosity, which is incredibly striking when seen in person. And likewise here we see that gold was used for the flowers in Memoriam. So these flowers were not included in any preparatory sketch, and they weren't underdrawn during the underdrawing process, but instead De Morgan had painted the drapery in the background and then applied gold on top of paint to create this outline of the flowers, and then she would use yellow and green paint to paint on top. And again, we have this sort of transcendent divine light coming through the flowers when you look very closely. I should note that De Morgan does have a preference for gold, which is seen in her gold drawings, such as the compositional study for Gloria in Excelsis. And I think that her use of gold really attests to her technical skill, because in applying this material, you can't make any mistakes or corrections because they're easily seen. But instead, De Morgan would have had to make each stroke very precise and correctly in the first instance. But I'd like to make this comparison between her gold drawings and her blocking in with the gold is quite different, because in some cases, the gold in her paintings can't always be seen, but I think that they undoubtedly have a symbolic purpose behind them. And it's just an incredibly unique technique of blocking in gold and then painting directly on top. So then once the paint perhaps fades over time, then this gold becomes a lot more brighter and shines through these losses. So it's undoubtedly symbolic and something that I would love to explore further by looking at more of her paintings and this very unique technique. Here is just another example of gold, and that it can symbolize different meanings depending on the content of the work. But here we see gold being used in slightly different ways. So gold was painted over in Lux in Tenebris, which is on the left, so that the landscape is seen through the aura and then it's lit by the gold shining from the figure's presence. And then on the right, we have Flora, where the gold is far more obvious as the figure's drapery is completely illuminated with gold paint. And as I mentioned, if you view the painting from a different angle or in different lighting, the gold becomes far more obvious depending on where you're standing, the sort of environment where the painting is. And then I will just quickly talk about varnishing in the 19th century. So the paintings that I examined, I noted that both paintings exhibit a greenish yellow fluorescence in ultraviolet light, which is suggestive of a varnish. However, I am keeping in mind that although it is unclear whether De Morgan varnished her works, it was trendy that during the 19th century, dealers would varnish works for sale or auction. So when I looked at these works initially, I did keep in mind that the varnish may not be original, but later applied. And then I will show you the barred gate again, which is behind me, and I've been treating. This painting has an uneven fluorescence, suggestive of a varnish. However, I am keeping in mind that this painting is unfinished, so it's unlikely that the artist would have applied a varnish, a final varnish at least. But rather, I think that this painting is a really rare example of De Morgan's use of a resinous material as an interlayer. So she uses this wetting out technique as she's painting, where she'll varnish certain elements of the composition to understand what it would look like if it was varnished, or just again perhaps use it as a saturating layer to understand what needs to be added to that area in order to create the tone or the color that she desires. So yeah, this painting is just a very rare example of perhaps an artist applied varnish, but it's not part of the final appearance. It's more part of the artist's working process and her figuring out the gloss or texture or color of her paints. So overall, technical analysis has demonstrated that a constant exchange of ideas within the Pre-Raphaelite circle undoubtedly contributed to the shaping of De Morgan's practice. And I think this influence is demonstrated in the artist's choice of primed supports, her application of transparent glazes, and her meticulous observation of life. Both paintings, however, do represent how the brilliance of De Morgan's palette coupled with her skills in draftsmanship, were completely idiosyncratic. De Morgan's conscious adoption and combination of newly available pigments arguably places her as a key figure in the development of Victorian painting practice. I think that these new technical insights into De Morgan's intentionally symbolic application of gold and her concise construction of imaginary elements have illuminated the way that her spiritual and sort of philosophical beliefs is considered. And we can clearly see that she was influenced by her training at Slade because of her consistent practice of drawing preliminary studies from the nude and then the draped model. And this is integral to understanding the intellectual context in which her artistic practice was formed. I would like to thank all of those involved in the project, including Sarah Hardy and the trustees of the De Morgan Foundation, Crown Fine Art, and all of my tutors at the Courtauld Institute of Art. I really look forward to continuing my research on De Morgan, and I've left my details if any of you have some questions, or if we have time, I'm happy to answer them now for you. But thank you so much for listening.
And thank you so much for speaking, Alexandra. That was just such a wonderful topic to speak on, completely new research and illuminating literally unseen and unthought of aspects of De Morgan's artistic practice before, well, before you got your hands on them, basically. I do have a few questions. We are a little bit over time, so I will ask the two that we have. And whilst I'm doing that, if anyone else has any questions, please do pop them in the chat box. From Margaretta, do we know the context of the explanation of technique to May Morris? May must have asked about it in order for De Morgan to write.
Yes, so unfortunately, I've been unable to visit the British Library where the letter is, because they had some sort of issue, so they weren't welcoming any visitors. But I'm hoping to look through that file and then find out the letter that May Morris wrote to Evelyn to begin with, and then that will provide some more context. But nevertheless, the glycerin technique is completely unusual. I haven't come across that before, and it's something that I would want to replicate as well, to try and understand her intentions with that. So that's yet to come, that research.
An exciting project using the glycerin and a pumice. Another question about the Holman, the letters about the Holman Hunt letter. Do you know if there were regular correspondence about technique, or whether that letter's sort of unusual?
That is the only letter I found that mentions technique. In general, De Morgan rarely writes about the methods or materials that she's using. So that was a really rare example. I know that De Morgan and Holman Hunt would often talk to one another. It's the same with Watts and Stanhope. But in terms of De Morgan actually writing about her techniques or hinting to what she was using at the time is very rare. So, yeah.
Lovely, thank you. And then a question from Fiona. She's intrigued that Evelyn did not appear to need her paintings extended or cut down by the colourman, as Dante Gabriel Rossetti and Edward Burne-Jones often did when they changed their composition. The ledgers that Fiona has looked at for a fabulous blog now live on the De Morgan Foundation website, just as an aside and a bit of a plug. Fiona says that these ledgers do not really show any examples of her changing the size of her canvases. So more of a comment, but did you find anything in the sort of the physical nature of the pictures that you looked at that might speak to that?
So for Queen Eleanor and In Memoriam, they both had pinholes in the canvas. So I assume that maybe in some cases De Morgan purchased sort of a loose canvas and then would pin it to an easel or a wall, paint her composition, and then the stretcher would have been made purposely for the size of that painting. And then in other cases, she buys canvases that were already stretched on the stretcher. So that would then limit the extent of her composition. I do think a lot of it also comes from her preparatory studies, and that she must have been using a transfer technique for her figures. And in doing so, that would also limit the extent of her composition. So she would transfer the figure onto the canvas and then paint the interior behind. But she was definitely pinning her canvases. I could see evidence much like her slave studies as well, where we have these pinholes in each corner. But the fact that she was purchasing pre-stretched, pre-primed canvases kind of notes that she already had an idea of the measurements of her paintings. And then also framing is something I want to look into as well, whether she had frames made for her compositions before she started painting or after she had started painting, and then that would also help determine what kind of dimensions she had in mind. Yeah, it was definitely thought out very thoroughly beforehand.
Yeah, and I think that, you know, you've mentioned and showed examples of the way that she would plan the drapery on the figures by using the nude study first. It kind of speaks to her having that really meticulous technique as well, doesn't it, in that sense?
Exactly.
I hope you can see the chat box, Alexandra, because we've got some lovely comments in there. Lots of people saying huge thank yous for your research and the insights that you found from looking at the pictures. But I suppose a final question from me, just to wrap everything up, is a bit more about your journey, I suppose, with conservation rather than about your findings with De Morgan. To read those images and make sense of everything that you're looking at, whether that's through the microscope or on the painting itself. I mean, how long has this process taken? You know, that you can see one of those fabulously bright neon images that you showed De Morgan at the disco and be able to interpret that and just to tell us a bit more about what it is that you've been doing at the Courtauld and where you are with things, really.
Yeah, absolutely. It does certainly take time in order to get your eye in on noticing certain techniques or trends, depending on the artist or the period that you're looking at. But I studied at the Courtauld. I did my bachelor's degree in art history, so I already had an understanding of this period, and my passion has stemmed from when I was a young child anyway. So I came into it with this interest to begin with. And then I did a master's in technical art history at Glasgow University. So that taught me how to use all of this equipment that I've been using and get the training in order to understand what I'm looking for and what this tells me about the artist, whether it's non-invasive techniques or invasive techniques, and weighing up those decision-making skills. And then my course at the Courtauld has been a 3-year postgraduate diploma. So it's been almost 7 years. I'll be graduating in 5 weeks. But this course in particular, as I'm conserving these artworks, the more and more you look at them using these methods of analysis, you get your eye in, and as you're treating them as well, you kind of understand the artist's intentions, and then that alters your decision making in treating these works. But De Morgan was an interesting one because no analysis has been undertaken on her works. I was sort of the first one to use these scientific methods. I was the first one, and it was hard to not reach conclusions straight away. I wanted to be open-minded because I was only looking at a small selection as well. So it may be the case that some of her earlier works are completely different, or whether she changed her mind during her later period. So yeah, I do have to thank all the tutors that had helped me though, to get different expertise and just different eyes in, different opinions. It always helps. It's certainly not a field that you can go into alone. It's a very collaborative process, so it's been incredibly useful.
And to us as well. And from the names of some of the people on the talk today, we've certainly attracted a number of art historians and people who spend their careers looking at paintings. And I know that your work's going to be immeasurably helpful to people as we continue to find out more about De Morgan and the Pre-Raphaelite circle she's associated with, and understand what we can about their paintings. So huge thanks again, Alexandra. Thank you to everybody listening for sticking with us. I know that was a little bit longer than advertised, but it's so interesting that it was well worth it. And I hope to see everybody again in the future. Thanks again, Alexandra.
So much. Thank you everyone for listening.
Thank you. Bye-bye.